Hello over there, dear viewers. Palestinians in Gaza Strip have been left once again with no moment to breathe, rushing from one area to another in an attempt to identify their relatives killed in the Zionist airstrikes. In many cases, digging through the rubble with bare hands. The Hamas movement confirmed on Wednesday that 7 captives, including settlers and 3 foreign citizens, were killed in the Zionist bombing of Jabalia, in the Zionist ground invasion also into Gaza Strip entered its 3rd day on Wednesday, with the Zionist army confirming that 15 of its soldiers have been killed so far. So, what is happening in Gaza and continues to date is beyond imagination at all levels. How could Gaza, which was besieged a few years ago, be transformed into a striking military force in which the resistance controls twice of its area in reclaimed settlements that were taken by the occupier? To this point, multiple questions come to the scene. What is really happening in Gaza? Was this a preordained plan for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians by the Zionist occupier? Why and how? The biggest army in the world, alongside with its Western allies, notably the US, the UK, couldn't make one advanced step inside the Gaza Strip. Are they afraid, or Hamas reveal their weaknesses? To answer all these questions, I'm joined live by Mr. Jalal Silmi, Regional and International Affairs Researcher from Istanbul, Turkey, and Ms. Ornila Sokar, that will join us later on, specialized in Middle East affairs from Lebanon, alongside with Bilal Saab, Director of Defense and Security Program at Middle Institute from Washington. And later on also we will be joined with Ms. Sahar Khamis, Associate Professor, Department of Communication, Maryland University from United States. A short break and we start our debate. So, before we delve into our discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. In Gaza, the Palestinian Ministry of Health has reported that the ongoing Zionist aggression has resulted in the tragic toll of over 8,796 lives lost. This includes more than 3,648 children casualties and 2,290 women. The total count of Palestinian martyrs and wounded due to the continuous aggression in Gaza and the West Bank has risen to 8,850 martyrs and more than 2,400 wounded. Tragically, more than 10,000 Palestinians are dead or missing as a result of the Zionist occupation's actions, including over 2,500 students from various educational levels. So, starting with you, Mr. Jalal Silmi, from the latest developments on the ground in the light of the new massacre perpetrated by the Zionist occupation inside Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza Strip, what is the main goal of the occupation behind this escalation?
مساء الخير لكم للجمهور العزيز. أتصور بأن هناك
I believe that there is an agenda for the Zionist entity, so there is not a clear objective. Some airstrikes are being carried out and some ground offensive are being carried out to give the impression that there is a success that is being made on the ground. So there are axes that are empty from any inhabitants and remote areas which are isolated, and the occupation didn't manage actually to advance in these sectors. There are many obstacles that are besetting the occupation in its path because the resistance faced up to this path and to this advance. This is why we believe that the ground offensive will be limited, and at the end of the day, there will be, in a week or 2 week time, as at the latest, there will be the declaration of a lull or a ceasefire. There will be consultation on the broad negotiation that will include all the parties to end the conflict that is prevailing now in Gaza.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Jalal, staying with you today, the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt was open to allow dual nationals and wounded Palestinians to exit the Palestinian enclave. How can we interpret this initiative? Can we say, or rather we assume that finally the whole world reached an agreement to give the humanity another chance?
يمنح البشرية فرصة أخرى.
للأسف الشديد هذه صورة صارخة.
Unfortunately, this is a blatant image that there is not a sovereign attitude of some Arab countries. You can imagine that the crossing that links Gaza and Egypt is controlled by the Israeli side. The American side is applying pressure on Egypt not to open the crossing. There is a reality in both sides of the crossing, given that many wounded, many injured people, many martyrs, and there is a lack of fuel. There is a shortage on medical supplies and medical equipment. We're speaking about a humanitarian crisis in all its dimension, and we haven't found any approach that serves the Palestinian residents in an appropriate way, in a needed way, or at least in a humanitarian way. We don't want to have a political intervention from the Egyptian side. Nobody can intervene in that. But at least this crossing is a sovereign crossing that is managed and owned by Egypt. There is why there were questions why the humanitarian aid that are funneled from Egypt to Gaza are controlled by the Israeli side, and why the Egyptian side is hampering the entry of numbers of injured. Now we have 80 injured that crossed the border out of 15,000 wounded and injured. We're speaking about a pandemic, and in the face of this pandemic, there is no decision that is living up to Egypt, this regional power that is required actually to have a great and large-scale intervention. But unfortunately, they yielded to the American pressure. There were also other Western pressure. As you may know, Egypt is suffering an economic crisis. Egypt is afraid of mass exodus or mass displacement of people. This is why it engaged in a negotiation with the American side. At the end of the day, the American side was convinced by opening the Rafah crossing, and they did open it.
Thank you so much for this explanation, Mr. Jalal. Stay with us. Now let's come to you, Mr. Ahmed. Causing the largest possible of number of martyrs, raising entire residential areas to the ground, is this means to influence the negotiation process and reach a deal to free the detainees, or is it meant for other purposes? I mean, the apartheid policy, if you know what I mean. Have you got the question, Mr. Ahmed Saab? Mr. Bilal Saab?
Bilal. Yes, I did get the question. Sorry, when you said Ahmed, I got a little bit.
No, it's okay. Mr. Bilal Saab, the martyrs and raising entire residential areas to the ground, is this means that this is the only solution that the occupation forces are doing, or they are looking for an apartheid policy? They are not looking to negotiate to release detainees.
Yeah, that's a hard question. First of all, let me just say this is the first time I do Algerian news. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and it's such an honor. I am very pleased to be with you tonight. This is a good question, my friend. And I will tell you from the moment the Israeli government came up with this unrealistic, incredibly inhumane, and frankly, nonsensical objective of wiping out Hamas, we knew from day one that this was going to lead to a carnage, to a humanitarian catastrophe, and to incredible collateral damage. And that's precisely what we're seeing today. We should not be surprised by that, because the very objective from day one was unrealistic and it was not achievable. So now you're seeing, even though I agree with Jalal, and I was listening to him very carefully, your previous guest, when he said that the ground invasion is going to be much more limited because the Israelis now recognize that they cannot achieve that objective of wiping out Hamas. Therefore, they're going to rely much more on air power. And with air power, we've seen it throughout history. With air power, you cannot defeat an insurgent group. You need ground forces. You need infantry on the ground, and they just do not want to enter into those tunnels because they understand the risks of that, and they understand that Hamas has the advantage in those tunnels. So you're going to see, sadly, unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong on this, a lot more than what we saw in Jabalia over the past 24 to 48 hours. And I just like you, I suspect that the intentions of the Israelis are not good. I think that there's a broader purpose behind this carpet bombing, frankly, which is to force the exodus of the population in Gaza into Egypt or into Jordan or somewhere else. I think that plan is going to fail precisely because of what Jalal was talking about as far as Egypt's position. But we're going to have to wait and see. And hopefully the Americans, that means us, will step in and apply diplomatic pressure.
Very good indeed. Now, before moving on to another question, let's tackle this piece of information. Ashifa Hospital received a substantial number of casualties, including martyrs and wounded individuals, after the Zionist occupation targeted a gathering of civilians in front of a Sharq bakery on An-Nasr Street in Gaza City. Tragically, even ambulances were targeted during rescue operation. Mr. Jalal, the occupation announces the loss of a number of its soldiers, amounting to 13, and the Zionist army chief admits that it is a painful blow. How do we explain this? Is this a statement showing how hard the ground offensive would be for the occupier? Does this mean that a small group of such Hamas pushed one of the strongest armies in the world to its limits?
بالضبط هذا ما نراه على أرض الواقع.
We see on the ground. Why we're saying this? Because all the indicators indicate that. When you look at what was broadcast by the Hamas movement today, so they show that there is tremendous resistance. As a landowner, as a land owner, so you have more motivation to confront and to fight any occupier. As you may know, the resistance in Palestine prepared that since 2009, and we're speaking about 14 years of time that has gone by, and there is a development in the resistance, so the battles will be fierce and it's inevitable, and we have to point out that to a very important element, which is the collapse of the unit of Gaza that is included within the occupation forces, which was in charge of elaborating and organizing these kind of operations, as you may know. So the Al-Qassam brigades managed to enter into the occupied territories and arrested several generals, and this weakened the occupation. This is the first element. And the second element is within the structure, the internal structure of the Zionist entity. So there are many contingency officers who are not entitled and qualified to face up to those crises. We're speaking about the latest war that was waged by Israel in 2014, and it couldn't achieve the advance that it pretended to. And after 9 years, the resistance has evolved, and the defense measures and procedures are higher level. And the third element is to weaken the Israeli army. There is a kind of arrogance and pride that is prevailing in the mentality of the occupier, who doesn't want to admit its failure and its failure in the ground. So it doesn't accept that there is a resistance that can
quietly understood, Mr. Jalal. Just since you do have a limited time, Mr. Jalal, what is your expectation in the coming days? Can we see a solution for this war, or there will be another more escalation?
As a matter of fact, we're speaking about a colonizer and a colonized. So there are people who are under occupation, and we're speaking about a permanent conflict. So there will be attempts by the resistance to change the reality on the ground. As I said earlier, we're speaking about a movement that goes for a week or two at the latest, and there will be a negotiation to announce or declare a ceasefire, or to go towards a solution into Gaza to ease the circumstances and the conditions. I think that this will happen 10 years after that.
Thank you ever so much for taking part with us, Mr. Jalal Sinmi, Regional and International Affairs Researcher from Istanbul, Turkey.
Thank you.
Now, moving on to another piece of information. Before coming to you, Mr. Saab, let me read for you this. The Al-Qassam brigades released footage of the fighters engaging with Zionist vehicles east of Az-Zaytun neighborhood, resulting in the destruction of several enemy vehicles. So, if we talk about the Zionist military plan, Mr. Saab, there are tunnels for the Hamas movement, and there are certainly plans that were perpetrated and prepared years ago. So to this point, can we say that Hamas is exploiting the occupation weaknesses in thwarting their attacks? In other words, the ground military operations.
Oh, I would agree with that 100%, my friend. This is precisely what Hamas wanted from the first place. They're not dumb not to know that the Israelis were going to go after them in the tunnels, but that's precisely where they want them. They want them fighting in the tunnels because this is where they have the advantage. And this is where they are better trained to fight the Israelis. They do not have an advantage, obviously, in air power. They do not have an advantage above the ground. They want to fight them below the ground. And they have been trained precisely for that kind of fight by the Iranians, by Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have been preparing for this for years, not months, not weeks. And so it's almost like a trap that the Israelis have fallen into. And they want them in there in the tunnels with them because this is where they can bleed them. This is where they can exploit their weaknesses, even though the Israelis and the IDF have units that are specialized for subterranean warfare, that are specialized for urban warfare. But in these cases, it's always the adversary that has the advantage because they know the local terrain. They can cause all sorts of damage to the Israelis. And as you very well know, Israeli society is very sensitive to casualties. And so all Hamas has to do is survive, and then they declare a victory. It is not the same calculus. It is not the same logic for the Israelis. And so you can already see the balance of power shifting in favor of Hamas just because of the very difference in terms of how they view casualties and how they view sacrifices that they're going to put up into the fight.
Very good indeed, Mr. Bilal Saab. Successive massacres by the occupation in various areas of the Gaza Strip, the latest of which is the attack against the Jabalia camp, under the pretext of Hamas' presence in these camps. Will this affect the course of the battles?
Man, I sure hope so, because I want the Israelis obviously to uphold international law, but they're just not doing that. And this is nothing surprising. I mean, look, I'm originally from Lebanon. I remember very well. I was 16 years old when the Israelis bombed Qanah, which is the UNIFIL, United Nations facility in southern Lebanon, and there were all sorts of innocent people who are trying to find shelter there. So this is nothing inconsistent with Israeli tactics. It is inhumane. It is against international law. My hope is that as this thing drags on, and my fear is that it will drag on, this is not going to end tomorrow, it's not going to end next week, that international outcry will be louder, international pressure on the Israelis would be much stronger, and there will be something of some kind of a ceasefire like Jalal was talking about before. I just want the Americans to step up. I want us to hold the moral high ground and not just have a slap on the wrist of the Israelis and just have private talks about them to reduce collateral damage. I want us to have more moral leadership, which sadly the Biden administration is not exercising right now.
Very good indeed. Now, let's tackle this also. Another new information, the head of the political bureau of the Palestinian resistance movement, Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, revealed that the movement of the informant mediators of the need to put an immediate end to the massacre and genocide that are occurring in Gaza because of the Zionist aggression. Haniyeh said that Hamas presented a comprehensive vision that begins with stopping the aggression and opening the crossings through a prisoner exchange deal.
لقيام دولة فلسطينية أبلغنا الوسطاء بضرورة وضع حد لهذه المجزرة.
We have told mediators that it is necessary for this massacre and genocide to stop immediately. Hamas has presented a full proposal that starts with stopping the aggression, opening the crossings, a hostage deal, and end with a political path to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds as its capital with the right to self-determination.
فلسطينية مستقلة وعاصمتها القدس وحق تقرير المصير. ولكن نتنياهو يماطل.
Netanyahu is stalling and tricking his people by delivering false promises. We will not allow him to deliver them. Their successful governments have failed in fulfilling all these promises.
Mr. Saab, despite the genocide war crimes in Gaza Strip, Washington does not demand a ceasefire. Therefore, what is required today for Washington to say to the occupation, enough bloodshed? Why is the U.S. taking the war in Gaza as a personal matter? Does this mean that it is a proxy war waged by the U.S. through the Zionist entity?
Well, look, I mean, you're not surprised, right? I mean, the United States has supported Israel unconditionally for decades, and we have never been an honest broker in this conflict. So I'm not shocked by what's happening. The only hope for this that could shape American policy and shape the Biden administration's policy and make them do the right thing is going to be internal pressure from progressive groups in the United States, in Washington, applying pressure on the Biden administration to end this carnage, end this conflict, and go for a ceasefire. Without that domestic pressure, which, by the way, you're seeing some every now and then, and you see protests against the war, you see people in Congress stopping congressmen from doing speeches you saw just the other day Secretary Blinken delivering a speech, and there were just a bunch of people inside the building calling for a ceasefire. The more you see those, the more you see domestic pressure, this is when the president is going to be feeling that his policy is unsustainable and that he really needs to change tack, because you got to remember, this is election season. Biden is losing a lot of Arab Americans as he goes through his re-election season, and he's losing a lot of progressives. Now, I'm not saying they're going to go vote for Republicans and they're going to vote for Trump, but they're making it a whole lot more difficult for the president to ignore their wishes. And my hope is that that kind of societal pressure is going to snowball and get us to a point where policy on the part of the Biden administration is going to change. That's my hope.
Quite interesting. Probably this is out of my questions list, but I have a question that comes to my mind whenever I talk about this, the so-called Israel government. What is special about this entity? I mean, whatever happened in this world, for instance, now if we talk about Russia and its military operation in Ukraine, the whole world put sanctions, notably US, on Moscow. But when it comes to the Zionist entity and its continuous aggression over humanity, not Gazans, they are humans after all, why no one put the fingers and dare to hold them accountable for the actions? What is special about this Zionist entity?
Well, that's a tough question, my friend. I have always wondered why we, at least the United States, I can't speak for the rest of the world. I mean, I live in Washington. I've been here for 22 years, but I have always had my suspicions, my concerns, my doubts, my questions about our unconditional support for the state of Israel. I am not calling for the termination of that support. You have to understand where I'm coming from. But I am calling for us to have moral leadership and for us to play an honest broker in this conflict and to actually push for peace as opposed to unconditionally supporting the Israelis and actually save them from themselves. I mean, the number one enemy of Israel is actually Israel. I mean, the Israeli governments, one after the other, have never found a way to make peace with the Palestinians and to accept a two-state solution, which is the root cause of this entire problem. And so, look, are we going to have a conversation here about why we always unconditionally support the Israelis? There are many factors, and there are many reasons why we do that, starting with organizations in this country that are very much pro-Israel and that influence U.S. policy. This is not going to change. We're going to have this for a long period of time. But I just feel like the tide is slightly changing in the United States in terms of the political current, because in the past, we never saw any kind of protest against, U.S. unconditional support of Israel. That is slowly but surely changing. The question is it changing fast enough and effectively enough and strong enough to change policy? I can't answer that question right now, but I know that the trend is moving, I hope I'm not naive on this, in the right direction. I think you started to see that with the Obama administration. Of course, it got screwed up with the Trump administration, and we went back to zero. And now with Biden, it's sort of in between. And I just hope that at least we could do the bare minimum, which is a ceasefire and an end to this carnage. And actually, what I also believe, I agree with you with your headlines, is a genocide against the Palestinian people.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. And derived from your words, it just comes to my mind, my master's of my paper I have prepared, that's a topic talk about the Jewish lobby behind the U.S. power, a diagnostic study in educational and also military sphere. And I remember, and I quote, Harun Sharon, who said that we, the Jewish people, we control America and Americans know it. It just amazed me how such speech comes to the minds and ears of Americans, and they know he is right. So based on this explanation, I'm not going to ask another more about this.
Well, my friend, he's not right. He's not right. I think he's full of crap. There is a special bond between the two, and again, it's old, it's deep, so we're not going to get into that. But it is much more than the Israelis controlling American policy and American public opinion. We have to recognize, whether we like it or not, that there is an old special bond between the Jewish people, especially Americans here, and the state of Israel. And it's not going to change. I don't have a problem with that bond. I have a problem with us unconditionally supporting the Israeli government, and especially the rightist, racist Israeli governments. And that's what I'm trying to change. I'm not trying to change the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Mr. Ahmed, Mr. Bilal Saab, I really do apologize because you really remind me of my friend who calls Ahmed. Some people claim that the occupation is confused and still shaken by the October 7th attacks. And so far, after almost a month now, the entity has no clear strategy, but a retaliation scheme against innocent and defenseless civilians. So, according to you, Mr. Saab, what has the Zionist army achieved except killing civilians?
Well, that's another good question. And I fear that on the minds of the Israelis, first and foremost, is revenge. This is what is driving the strategy. There's nothing rational. There's nothing instrumentalist, meaning that there's no strategy-driven objective behind this. And that's precisely what, if you recall, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told the Israelis. He told them, I hope that your next moves your efforts to respond to Hamas's attack are not going to be driven by revenge. But that's precisely what the Israelis are doing. You cannot explain this kind of collateral damage. You cannot explain this kind of massive killing of innocent civilians without alluding to this kind of blind rage and frankly unfathomable violence that they are imposing on the Palestinians collectively, not just Hamas, but the Palestinian people as well. So what they have achieved is basically an international public opinion that is slowly but surely shifting on the side of the Palestinians, which is something that we've seen before. We've seen this movie before. There's nothing shocking about this. It's always in the beginning where international public opinion, or at least most international public opinion, is kind of sympathetic to the Israelis after there's an attack against them. But then as this thing drags, as the Israelis shoot themselves in the foot, as they commit mass murder, then international public opinion changes. And so have they achieved something significant or strategic? Absolutely not. They've done nothing but, I would say, kill innocent civilians, achieve very little on the battlefield, and frankly even change their own strategy as far as switching from a ground offensive or full-fledged invasion into something much more based on air power, perhaps surgical strike, but of course the massive bombing of refugee camps that have so many innocent civilians dying as a result. And so they are so far from a strategic victory. And frankly, I'm not shocked by that, because no matter what they do to Hamas, they're always going to be a Hamas, because Hamas is not just a group. It's not an organization. It's not just a movement. It's an idea. It's an idea of resistance. And as long as there's occupation, there's going to be resistance, whether the Israelis like it or not.
Very good indeed, and all people have the right to defend their lands. Mr. Saab, Netanyahu says that the occupation has no intention of remaining in Gaza. In your opinion, as specialist in this matter, to whom this speech is directed? To the Gazans or to the Zionist interior? Considering that he said that the results of the ground operation would be in his favor.
I think he's speaking to two audiences. I think he's speaking to the Israeli public and first, and he's speaking to the Americans, because we certainly do not want the Israelis to occupy Gaza again. I don't think the Israeli government wants to do that either. And so that in itself, the statement is also extremely problematic, because that shows you once again that the Israelis have no clue what happens the day after. All they want to do is just go in there, use violence, and try to kill as many Hamas operatives as possible. And with that, of course, many Palestinian citizens. But they have no clue what happens the day after. They do not have an exit strategy. They do not have a strategy for who governs Gaza after this. They are not talking to the Palestinian Authority. They're not talking to Hamas. They're not talking to Mahmoud Abbas. All they're doing is trying to kill as many Palestinians as possible, try to force them into an exodus to go to Jordan or Egypt, so that there's no one left, so that they can actually level Hamas without having to worry about Palestinian civilians. But the last thing the Israelis want is to govern or occupy Gaza. That's not what they want. And Netanyahu is telling his Israeli public that to reassure them, because not a single Israeli wants to see the Israeli army actually occupying Gaza once again, because that would be another Vietnam for them, to be honest with you.
Very good indeed. And back to the point we have already discussed, Israelis, as you may have mentioned, or rather settlers, they keep pushing and putting a lot of pressure on Netanyahu government and him personal, because whenever Netanyahu comes to the rule, there will be an escalation, there will be war, because this is his main aim to clean the people, Palestinians, from the earth. I mean, why do such kind of leaders in the world keep having an unconditional support, not from only US, but also from Europeans? Why?
Look, I'll be honest with you. It was very hard for your average Westerner to see what happened on October 7th. And so there was a lot of sympathy for the Israelis after the massacre of civilians, average people at that festival, and the killing of innocents on the part of Israelis. That was very hard. And so they related to the Israelis. They gave them the benefit of the doubt, and they supported their response to what Hamas had done. Now the question is, after that, how long are you going to support what Israel is doing right now, which I believe, and I think most people who with half a brain in the world will know that this is against international law. These are crimes against humanity. And so for that opinion on the part of leaderships around the world to switch from sympathy to condemnation or to criticism or to at least putting limits on the Israel's use of force, I would love to see that happen yesterday before today, but we haven't seen it happen yet because of a lot of influence that exists within the United States, whether it's in the UK or any other Western European country that is forcing these leaderships, forcing the governments to continue supporting Israel no matter what. I just hope that the only, as I said before, the only source of pressure that could really change the position of these leaderships is going to be internal. And it's going to be societies, publics in the West that are just fed up with Israel's approach to ending this conflict, which is completely unacceptable with the basic charter of human rights and international law. That is the only hope, frankly, that's going to be significant enough to change policy on the part of Western governments.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed, Mr. Bilal Saab. Now let's tackle this piece of information. European Union's top diplomats on Tuesday condemned the attacks by Zionist settlers on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Joseph Borrell called for a pause of all the aggression that the occupation forces are committing against Palestinians. The EU has previously called for humanitarian pauses to allow aid into Gaza.
It's very dire, and the only thing that we can do
still a meeting with.
In this matter, there is a document from the Zionist Minister of Intelligence that talks about transferring the people of Gaza to Sinai, which is situated in Egypt. Is it clear that Cairo now is under a pressure to receive the Gazans? But don't you think, Mr. Saab, that Gazans, or rather let me say Egyptians, and all the other Arab countries around Palestinians, that they will have another political mind, or they will keep still doing the pause and the silence? Don't you think that they will do another reaction?
Well, look, the Egyptians were pretty clear, if you recall, in the Arab summit that happened not too long ago. No more refugees, and heck, even the Jordanian king was even clearer and more firm about his policy, about his country's policy regarding accepting more Palestinian refugees. I think both countries are incredibly serious about this. And of course, there's some leeway, some flexibility in terms of allowing for humanitarian assistance, the humanitarian corridor, right? Opening up Rafah crossing, even though I still believe it's vastly insufficient. It's like a drop of water in the ocean, right? They need a whole lot more assistance than that. But when it comes to mass numbers, when it comes to really allowing Palestinians to settle in Egyptian territory or Jordanian territory, that is a huge red line for both countries. And this is now where diplomacy is happening. This is why we sent David Satterfield as a special envoy to try to get concessions from the Egyptians and from the Jordanians, but he's going to have a very hard time. There is no way he's going to, in my opinion, I hope I'm right on this, there's no way he's going to succeed in convincing the Egyptians and the Jordanians to accept more Palestinian refugees on their soil. Because guess what? If they know that if they accept more Palestinian refugees, there is no certainty that these people are going to go back home, right? And so with that uncertainty in mind, there is very little chance that Cairo or Amman are going to accept Palestinians because they know that they might just never go back home. And that's what the Israelis have done in the previous conflicts and in previous confrontations with the Palestinians. They end up forcing the exodus of these Palestinians and telling them that they can come back home after the cessation of hostilities, but they never go back home. Or they go back home and their homes are destroyed. They have nothing to go back for to.
Mm-hmm. Quite interesting. Mr. Saab, how much time left for the Palestinians? I mean, could the resistance keep up this resistance to its limits and to the final point, or the Zionist entity and the US troops and probably other Western troops, they will at the end invade the Gaza Strip?
I like this question because I believe that time is neither on Israel's side nor on Hamas's side. Let me explain why. Time is not on Israel's side because international public opinion is shifting. They cannot continue to bombard relentlessly the Palestinians and cause more collateral damage without suffering from political costs and diplomatic costs, and perhaps even a shift of opinion in the United States where we all of a sudden decide to stop aiding them diplomatically and even militarily. So time is not on Israel's side. But time is also not on Hamas's side, because Hamas at the end of the day has limited capabilities, right? And so if this thing is going to be a war of attrition, and you know what a war of attrition means that they're going to bleed Hamas slowly but surely. And those rockets and those missiles are going to run out at some point, right? And so they're going to have little firepower to deal with. Now, of course, there's still going to be smuggling through the tunnels. The Iranians are going to do their thing. The Egyptians, they're going to try to stop that smuggling from happening. But there's so many ways still to smuggle weapons into Hamas, especially if there's no ground incursion into the tunnels that is massive, right? But at the end of the day, there is still a limit to how much Hamas can actually fight the Israelis. And, you know, we haven't talked about an opening of another front. I mean, if Hezbollah in Lebanon opens a front against the Israelis, that could certainly help Hamas, of course. And that will give them, you know, a longer shelf life. But for now, it's been sort of under control on the northern front of Israel between Lebanon and Israel and Hezbollah. Heck, we're going to see, well, today is Wednesday. I think it's already in your neck of the woods. We're going to see what Hassan Nasrallah is going to say on Friday. There's going to be a very important speech. He's going to delineate the red lines of the group. He's going to say what his intentions are. But if that front opens, that is going to be very helpful for Hamas in terms of reducing the pressure that Israel is imposing on it, because Israel all of a sudden has to fight on two fronts, and it has to allocate resources on two fronts, which means it has less firepower to go against Hamas.
Thank you ever so much for the points you have raised, Mr. Bilal Saab. Very good points. And I will be back to you now. We are joined by Dr. Sahar Khamis, Associate Professor, Department of Communication from United States. Dr. Sahar, the international conscience has begun to awaken in many countries that supported the occupation. Will this affect the scene positively?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think that we are seeing some shift, not at the official governmental level, where the governmental support, a lot of countries in the West especially are still pretty much, supportive of Israel's stance and taking some kind of one-sided position, in many cases, pro-Israeli position. But we are seeing some kind of shift, I believe, on the grassroots level. I think that the amount or the number of demonstrations and protests we have been witnessing here in the United States, in Europe, in so many different parts of the world indicates that there is actually a broader awareness and more, sympathy and empathy with the Palestinian cause to a degree that is maybe unprecedented or unwitnessed before. And I think that social media and new media played a very important role in terms of trying to bring the images, the videos, the stories, the narratives of the average Palestinian people who are suffering day in and day out in the midst of this horrible situation that they find themselves in. So I really think that it's not so much about a shift in the official sphere as much as it's a shift in the grassroots level, and how the people in the different countries, even here in the United States, are starting to awake and to be aware of a different reality.
Quite interesting. The shift also now it becomes a little bit more official. Bolivia said Tuesday it has cut diplomatic ties with the Zionist occupation authority in Palestine. Neighbors Colombia also and Chile recalled the ambassadors to the Middle Eastern country for consultations. The three South American nations criticized the genocide committed by the Zionist forces on Gaza and condemned the deaths of Palestinian citizens. Dr. Sahar, the United Nations Children's Fund announcement that Gaza has become a graveyard for thousands of Palestinian children. As for the United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Coordinator Martin Griffiths, he said that war against Gaza has entered a more terrifying stage. Do you think these statements would have an impact in stopping the war?
Yes, I think that the gravity of the amount of destruction and carnage and killing and the loss of human lives, we have more than 10,000 martyrs in Gaza so far. Many of them, or most of them, are actually children under the age of 15. That has started to really attract international attention and to really put shame on all of the countries and nations that did not take action swiftly or quickly or sufficiently enough to really intervene and try to put an end quickly to all of these aggressions against the unarmed civilians in Gaza. So I think that we are seeing this awakening. And I talked before about the grassroots awakening, and you mentioned some of the countries that cut diplomatic ties with Israel. I think that it's also important to mention some of the officials who have taken individual positions along these lines as well. We have one senior official in the Department of State here in the United States who said that he cannot in all good consciousness continue in his own position afterwards because he feels that he's ashamed of being part of the Department of State, and that the Department of State has taken a one-sided position in support of Israel and did not pay attention to the suffering of the average Palestinians, and therefore he resigned from his position. Also, an official in the United Nations has done the same thing. So it's not just about the countries that you mentioned. Of course, that's an important point to highlight, but also some officials here and there, even though their numbers are small. But I think the message they send is very strong, very powerful, and very impactful. As for the UN as a body, I think that the world has been looking at it with a lot of disappointment and frustration because it has not really done its part in this whole crisis. When the United Nations Secretary came to the Rafah crossing, he was shouted at by the angry Egyptian protesters, and he was denounced for not taking sufficient action to stop all of these aggressions and all of these hostilities.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Back to you, Mr. Bilal Saab. You already have talked about opening another front of battle. I believe yesterday Yemen also hit with multiple rockets at the Zionist entity. Also Lebanon by Hezbollah. Also there were rumors that even Syria they hit. So do you think if other fronts and other, let me say, other armies engage in this war, what will be the circumstances at the end?
Well, I mean, nobody wants to see that happening, obviously, but the problem is that as the intense shelling of the Israelis continues, that risk of escalation goes up. And you're already seeing an exchange of fires between Hezbollah and Israel that is escalating by the hour, by the day. First, it was a 2-kilometer perimeter exchange of fires. Then it became 8 kilometers, and now it's going to be 15 kilometers. And it's getting deeper and deeper and deadlier by the hour. I don't recall anymore how many Hezbollah fighters Hezbollah has lost, but I'm guessing more than a dozen. And they've also killed Lebanese journalists who have been covering this war. You've mentioned the attacks from Yemen. Now you're seeing a whole axis that we've been talking about for a long time, controlled by Iran, all in the service of, checking Israeli aggression and checking its attempts to annihilate or destroy Hamas. Nobody wants to see a regional war, but everything the Israelis are doing are actually leading us into that scenario, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Dr. Sahar, what is expected from Blinken's visit to the Zionist entity in Jordan? Because now media broadcasting is shifting a little bit to transmit the bitter reality, and social media platforms, notably the X platform, are exposing the real events happening in Gaza. Don't you think that the State Department's speech will be different based on the global pressure condemning the genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. Because I think that the American policy has two different sides, right? There is the one public-facing side, which has been clearly pro-Israel from the very beginning, and complete solidarity and support, and sending ammunition and sending all the flight carriers or airplane carriers to the region and all of that stuff, which has been witnessed time and time again. But I think that there has been also an ongoing parallel discourse behind closed doors. That has been in the conversations between President Biden and Netanyahu, several phone calls, and also the tours that Blinken has been doing in the region. His previous tour, and especially this one, is especially impactful. The one he's going to start on Friday by visiting Israel and then visiting a number of Arab nations. I think that this time there is going to be a different tone. His emphasis is going to be primarily on how to contain this crisis and to make sure it does not spread and expand into some kind of regional crisis whereby other parties, especially Iran and Hezbollah, get more directly involved and escalate into a broader, bigger regional war, which is going to be difficult for anybody to contain. And the United States at this stage, coming close to the 2024 election, and also a lot of issues here in terms of mass shootings and the economy, a lot of domestic issues, I don't think the Biden administration is interested in being involved in a broad, all-out war and confrontation in the Middle East that they have to intervene in. That's not their priority, and they have other files like the Ukraine crisis and other things. So I think that his tone is going to be what can be done now in order to contain this situation. That may not be his public speech, but privately he's going to be talking about that definitely in his visit to Israel and to Arab nations as well.
Thank you ever so much. I believe we have reached the limited time. I have been called to put an end to the show. Mr. Bilal Saab, thank you ever so much for taking part with us for the first time in this show. Also, Dr. Sahar, thank you ever so much for being with us again. And special thanks to Mr. Jalal Silmi, who was with us later on. And then Samar, maybe next time will be with us. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for taking part with us in this late hour. For more updates, keep up an eye on the social media platform. Wishing the best for the Gazans people to save themselves.